Okay, so today I'll be doing another episode of the Absolutist philosophy. So this one is going to be that there are no rights, there are only restrictions, which is not exactly a quote that I said in my old debate format, but kind of the same idea. It's just sort of rizzing up baddies on Hinge. Why do you say that? Was that one of the apps I had on my phone when I was showing it? Like the Polybuzz, like I didn't even know what that was. I was just kind of downloading a bunch of random stuff, but apparently that can get you in trouble maybe, or whatever, like AI companion stuff, and they might do something a little bit naughty. But basically, what was I saying? Okay, so this, I hate always referring back to my old debate format, but it kind of gives a context to this, or it doesn't really matter, but just to give it some structure, especially for people who don't know like what I'm talking about, which they probably still won't know, but you know, whatever, it has some history to it. Oh, it's when I'm streaming on the phone, I use that because for some reason Streamlabs doesn't work at all. It crashes all the time on here, so I had to switch to a different one. And I actually have to pay to use it, like $10 a month, but whatever. Or like maybe you don't have to, but like you got rid of a watermark or something stupid. But okay, the point is, this one is called There Are No Rights, There Are Only Restrictions. And so this is the concept of the inherent man and contrivance response, which I talked about in my debate format obviously a lot. These are my terms, obviously, and so we're talking like 2013, 2014, and of course I stupidly didn't really save much from that or anything from that, so I have the Court of Reason channel, which does have some of these terms uploaded, but whatever, just in case you want extra context on what in the world I'm talking about, because it might seem a little bit difficult to understand. But basically the point is that, let's first of all define inherent man. So inherent man would be a term that means the base state of a human being without any external influence or contrivance, meaning society, without indoctrination, without social influence, without laws, without anything like that. So if you were just born in the jungle, and sure, your parents would raise you and live off the land and pick berries and hunt and whatever you got to do to survive, but that would be different than being indoctrinated into a society. So what that means is that base state, which is quite easy to observe from history, from even, currently tribes and different, more minimalistic people, but even just in a hypothetical sense, we can easily observe what that nature would be. And so inherent man is defined as, again, the base state of a human being without that sort of external influence and indoctrination. So that's an important term to understand. Korean app about to hack me. Is it even a Korean app? No, but I'm too valuable to them. They'd rather milk me for my $10 subscription, which is totally not worth it, just to be able to stream, just because Twitch itself doesn't let you stream in 1080p on their own app. I don't understand that with both Twitch and YouTube. You can't stream through Twitch directly on the phone in 1080p. It has to be 720p. And then on YouTube, you can't download your own videos in 1080p. You can only download them in 720p. So these huge corporations, these big platforms don't have the means to do what a third-party app is needed to do, which is just to simply download or stream in a, proper quality. It's not like 1080p is that much to ask compared to, like a 4K, some crazy thing like that. And so again, inherent man, the base state of a human being, uninhibited, not indoctrinated. And then what is the reaction to inherent man is contrivance response, or again, you could call this just society and laws and things like that. So contrivance response is the sort of, it's the way that we react as a society to inherent man. So if there's certain tendencies that people would have, and again, we like to personalize these things, but let's look at it objectively, right? We have laws, and we have morals, and we have everything that we pose, right, as like false absolutes and pretenses. These are like concepts from my old debate format, so this is like a philosophical idea here of the fact that, again, contrivance response, so whether it be morality, whether it be laws, whether it be some other social stigma, standards, etc., those things are not only are they not absolute, as they're sometimes posed to be, especially by religions and so forth. The sort of the three fallacious terms that are used here are either that it is inherent, it is absolute, or it is objective, right? All three of which are not attributable here because they require subjective human enforcement through laws, through indoctrination, through social stigma, etc. And so the point here is that sort of the trick and the trap of society is, despite whatever usefulness you might argue for it, is besides the point. The trick of it is to make you believe, right? This is what I call the false inherent contrivance response. It is to make people believe that the way they're indoctrinated to be by society is how they naturally are. And so we see a lot of this pretense that, like, okay, you're born into society, you're indoctrinated heavily by parents, by school, by media, by government, by social norms, etc. That doesn't mean those things aren't potentially good or useful, although you could hold them accountable and debate them. Maybe some of them are, maybe some of them aren't. If you were in World War II Germany, there was a particular program you would be in if you were young that might not be so good. So if you're in China right now, so you can always question those things on a specific basis, but what it means is they try to get you when you're young, and so now you have the impression that, oh, this is how people naturally are, this is how you are, and this is how it's meant to be, and you sort of unquestioningly accept that, when in reality that's not the case at all, right? So the reason why we have laws and we have social stigma, norms, morality, isn't because they're absolute, but because they're not, and so we have to subjectively reinforce them and give the illusion that they're absolute. So we have to actively uphold them, and so what that means is you're in a position to, I don't know, it's sort of a baseline fallacy, like with morality itself, where it would be treated like, oh, this is the right thing to do, and this is, absolute, and the, God's will, or it's meant to be, and it's inherent, Not only is that not the case, the very construct of morality is a response to our inherent nature. So, like, if people would naturally do all the bad things that we consider bad, that's why we call them bad, that's why we stigmatize them, that's why we have laws against them, that's why we have restrictions, that's why we have, again, social stigma, laws, indoctrination. So those are the two layers, right? We have the threat of enforcement, obviously, to say, like, okay, if you do a certain crime, a certain act that inherent man would be capable of doing, right, that would be our tendency potentially to do. So we're sort of acknowledging, see, it's the acknowledgement met with the pretense, like, oh, we're all good people, and people are good, and we'd never do anything wrong, right? We believe in the goodness of people, but we also acknowledge that we're not good by our own subjective standards, because if we were, we wouldn't need laws, we wouldn't need any of that. So we realize in practice that we're not good by our own subjective standards, but yet because that's why we need laws, etc., but we pretend we are at the same time. So there's some internal contradiction with this. It's similar to the basis of society itself, where there's like a pretense that, people are somehow good, or, again, by the own subjective standards that society, etc., opposes, but that people are good or they're somehow trustworthy, right? So you should treat them in a positive light. But on behalf of those same people and the same tendency, you have to inhibit every area of your own life on the assumption that they're not good, that you're not good, right? That we kind of are skeptical of everything. We have to all be restricted and dumbed down and restrained to a lowest common denominator state for, like, our own safety or for some other reason. So it's like, oh, you should trust people. Also, we're part of a society that restricts and inhibits every single thing in your entire life because we don't trust people, because we presume people are not trustworthy, right? So there's kind of that's the basic fallacy of society. Right, let me try to say it one more time more clearly, maybe. Just, again, the premise of society is that let's restrict and inhibit and reduce everything as much as possible, because we assume the worst of people, that, oh, we can't trust them, we need locks on our doors, we need security, we need cops, we need this, we need that. We have to always be weary, we're skeptical, we're, projecting, all these different things, right? So we have this all, and even just on an individual basis to rationalize, why are you so restricted? Why are you so inhibited? Why do you need permission for every little thing you do? Why, are you constantly kind of controlled and inhibited and dumbed down and not free? You're not your free inherent self. Why do you have to do that? So you're assuming that yourself and others don't have self-control, that you're not good by your own subjective standards. That's what you're assuming. That's the premise of society. All that inhibition is based on this premise. But then you're supposed to pretend that, oh, people are good and people are trustworthy. Well, if they were, this would be the absolutist phrasing that I use is, well, okay, people are good and trustworthy then, in which case we don't need those restrictions and inhibitions, and so let's do away with them and be fully free, and let's be inherent man, and we can control ourselves and self-govern. But you can't have it both ways and say, oh, people are good and trustworthy, but then we have to inhibit and restrict every area of life because we assume that they are not. And then getting back to contrivance response, you have the ability to consider the fact that, again, contrivance response is the reaction to inherent man, which means it doesn't validate that this is how people are. It actually kind of implies the opposite, right? Like, everything that we condemn is not because, oh, we wouldn't do it. It's because we would do it, and that's our way of trying to stop it. So the layers of that are, again, inherent man would do all the things that inherent man is capable of doing, right? Which could include things that we consider crimes and harming people and stealing and basically whatever. They would just do whatever, right? Just as in nature, as if animals, like there's no real law there. It's just, right, people would just do what their inherent nature and tendency could be to do, and everything that they're capable of doing. So how do we restrict that? So the first layer is indoctrination in youth. So you have that as a mental layer, like when you're young, your parents are going to teach you, oh, this is right, this is wrong, do this, don't do this. Society will reinforce it through media, through government, through social stigma, right? You'll reinforce it there, and then you'll, social shaming and stuff like that, public shaming, and then you'll also have enforcement in the back, sort of as the backbone of it all. And so that's an important distinction, because people may want to believe like, oh, we're all good people, and or like individually even like, oh, I'm a good person who would never do anything bad. But it's easy to say that when you have enforcement in place, right, and accountability, like, oh, so you wouldn't do it because you wouldn't do it because you could get caught and it's against the law and this and that, right? So if you took away those laws and there was no accountability and you can get away with it, then it would be a different story. Or it's like if, it's the kind of surface level, that's where indoctrination comes in. Like, you have the threat of enforcement to try and discourage people from doing criminal acts, etc., things that might, would be part of their inherent tendency. So again, it's not so much that, there's a certain phrase here that I'm searching for that I can't remember exactly how I said it. It's not that something is inherently wrong or immoral, right, that we call it that. It's actually the opposite. It's not like, oh, that we would never do that, that's why we condemn it. Or that's why, it's we wouldn't do it because it's bad. No, we pose it as bad in the first place to discourage ourselves from doing it, right? It's a little bit hard to explain that point, but so it's not that morality is objective or inherent or absolute at all. It's actually just a construct that's a reaction to the inherent things that we would do, that we try to discourage ourselves and prevent ourselves from doing. Which again, on a functional basis, you can certainly say that's okay, it's useful to do that. Nobody's arguing that laws shouldn't exist, right, or something like that. This would be the false duality framing that you sometimes get from stupid people trying to argue this, like, oh, that means you're arguing that these are bad things. No, we're just objectively observing the nature of the process, which is, right, they're constructs. Now we can argue how to best use those constructs to create the desired result, but don't pretend like there's something more than that, because in practice they're not. Like, even you want to pretend they're absolute, but then you still have to actively uphold them at the subjective level, like, again, law enforcement and stuff like that. So when we get back to contrivance response again in reaction to the inherent man, and so again, that's one of the things that is a very powerful fallacy, though, is the false inherent contrivance response. You try to pretend like the state that you're indoctrinated into in reaction to your inherent state is actually the real state of being, which is, even though it might seem fine, it's a... Okay, so it crashed there. I should stop doing it in even 720p. 480p would be fine, but whatever. What I was saying is, there's like the layers where you try to create the illusion of the absolute, or again, like after immense amounts of indoctrination in youth, you would insist, oh, I'm a good person and I would never do anything bad. And also you have the backdrop of knowing also there's enforcement and laws. So with all those layers in place, it's easy to say, oh, you would never do anything wrong, or the majority of people would never do anything wrong. But the fact that those things are necessary show you that it's not necessarily the inherent or true state. It's an artificial one that we're creating, right? And so now you recognize that, again, those are the layers that we try to appeal to. Enforcement is the operative one, where we would say, okay, if you do something that we consider bad subjectively, right, morally, society, then we'll punish you, we'll put you in jail, etc., right, things like that. And so that might seem like, oh, that's good enough, but that doesn't entirely work all the time, or it maybe is too obvious, right, that, oh, we're just going to threaten you. So instead, we have the other layers of like social stigma, social kind of conditioning, indoctrination, things like that, that try to make you think that it's your own idea, or to make you extract gratification and ego value from it. And so now you feel like, even with, you're not thinking about the enforcement, even though that's still present and still necessary in effect, you're thinking about, well, you know, somehow it makes me a good person and I feel good about it, and people will socially kind of reward me and gratify me if I behave a certain way. So you're trying to create like a backbone layer to it, where it's almost like you don't need enforcement, even though it's still necessary as a backdrop. You kind of create, again, those are the two layers. Like, if indoctrination fails, you have enforcement. If enforcement fails, you try to lean on indoctrination, right? So either way, you're trying to do it either directly, just say, okay, we're threatening you, if you do this, we'll lock you up and things like that. But the other layer is, okay, we'll try to prevent that from being what's relied on. So we'll try to socially engineer it to say, this is wrong, and try to convince you of that, and try to get you to do it on, again, the social level, without needing to just rely on enforcement, but it comes to the same thing. So the indoctrinated basis would be, trying to, I had a better way to explain this that I can't remember, like, you're trying to get people to do the same result without needing to directly tell them what to do. Like, it's easier to convince them that way. Oh, we're going to lock you up if you do something that society doesn't want you to do. But that sounds too forceful. So you say, oh no, you're a good person, and it's absolute, and it's God's will, and you'll go to heaven, and it's morality, and it's, oh wow, gratifying. So when we appeal to the ego, now it makes it feel like it's your own idea, or you want to do it, or you enjoy it, or it's somehow some higher cause or purpose, right? This is how the human ego is used to control people in a lot of ways. So it's easier to control people that way, right? When you say, oh no, it's not just some zero-sum process where we're trying to counter your inherent tendencies that you might do through the force of threat, right, and the threat of enforcement. Instead, we're going to say, oh no, it's absolute and it's meant to be and it's God's will and you go to heaven, and we try to appeal again to the ego that way. I have a similar explanation for the stimuli acme, like where society wants you to be with only one person in a relationship. And so how does society convince you of that? They don't just say, oh, that's easier for us to manage for taxes and for government and for, organization of society and even for the family system, right? Society is not going to just say that like, oh, it's just easier for us to control, so we try to make it like that. No, it'll, we'll try to appeal to the ego and say, oh no, it's absolute and it's love and it's meant to be and there's your soulmate and the one and only and it's, oh wow. So we try to turn it into something like desirable. So, oh no, you want to be restricted to just one person and it's special and it's love and it's meant to be and they're your soulmate, right? So you try to trick the ego into valuing something that is actually subversive in nature to what is otherwise an inherent, unrestricted process that we try to specify and structure. And the other point there is the fact that so you have to lay out the premise before I get to the point that I'm actually starting with, or the, and again, a lot of these things you have to realize that the basis of this whole thing was objectivity. So it's not that you're making a claim, right? Like I'm not making a claim, oh, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. You're objectively observing the nature of a process, and then you can decide for yourself what to make of it, or what your measure is, as I call it, kind of how you decide to interpret it. Because that's one thing in absolutist philosophy that I would talk about is, I had this phrase, like, don't assume intent. So you can never assume, like, even society as a whole, it'll be like, well, the goal of people that we can collectively agree upon and base our rules and stuff on is that, oh, people are trying to live as long as possible. Is that the basis of it? Or, how would you define it? But even that you can't do, because guess what? Some people, you smoke, you drink, so you have unhealthy food. So that shows you there's a hedonistic quality that might cut that, what I call the longevity process, short. So clearly living as long as possible isn't a universal intention. So in other words, you can't assume what people's intentions actually are. You have to just let it be and allow it to, So you can always tell people what to do, assuming the measure, like, okay, within this zero-sum measure of what we're trying to do, now we can try to empirically use that. But what you can't do, what if they don't value that measure? What if they value something else? What if they don't care about that? So that's what you bypass, is like you're operating under some assumption. So, okay, here's the last point, is that, again, you appeal to the ego like we were talking about. So that's how enforcement actually works. You might think, why would a person commit a crime or do something that we consider subjectively morally objectionable? Right? Why would somebody do that? They would do it presumably in their own zero-sum self-interest, right? They want something out of it. They want to steal. They want money. They want something they have to gain, right? So if the basis of a person committing a crime or doing something bad by our subjective moral standards would be their own ego and self-interest, then how do we stop them from doing it? Do we appeal to some higher standard or a higher measure, like, oh, God, and it's meant to be, and gratified, and morality, and absolute? Or, right, do we appeal to goodness or some other higher standard? Or do we simply appeal to the same exact standard, the same measure that would make them do it in the first place, their own self-interest? In other words, appeal to the ego. So how do we do that? We use enforcement or even social stigma to say, we're going to punish you, right? So we're threatening you and your own self-interest. We're putting that at risk and that at stake to prevent you from doing the same thing that you would do in self-interest. So that's a very, very important thing to understand. So the way to beat self-interest is also with self-interest. It's not a higher standard. It's not a higher measure, right? You're not saying that, the reason why somebody would commit a crime or do something bad is in their own zero-sum self-interest. So how do we stop them from doing that? Do we appeal to something different? No, we appeal to the same thing. We say, okay, we'll put you in jail and put your self-interest at risk if you do this. So the reason why people wouldn't do something in their self-interest is also in their self-interest, right? Because they're afraid to be punished and threatened. So again, just to realize, there is no absolute morality. There is no higher standard. It's the same exact thing you're appealing to. The same reason why somebody would do something bad is the same way we prevent them from doing that same bad thing by saying, either way, we're gonna either you're going to try to benefit the self, or we're going to try to punish the self, attack your self-interest, put your self-interest at risk. So therefore, you're committing the crime for selfish reasons, or you're not committing the crime for selfish reasons because you don't want to get caught or locked up. That would ultimately be the same basis of appeal, even though through indoctrination and social gratification, we try to convince ourselves that there's more to it than that. Again, to say, oh, we're not just being controlled by a process. People don't like to think that way. So, oh no, we're not being controlled by the process. We want to be controlled by the process. We're good people. We're gratified. We're, social reinforcement. So now we get to the actual point of what I started with, which is, so there are no rights. There are only restrictions. So if you go to inherent man, and you realize, okay, when a person is born into the world, they're capable of doing, obviously as they grow older and have more physical acuity and so forth, a person is capable of doing anything that they're capable of doing. Anything physically that they can do, they can just do. Right? So there is no inherent restriction aside from the laws of nature themselves that would physically prevent you from doing something. Right? So in other words, there are no restrictions. You just exist, and there you are. So now, instead of trying to say that, oh, you have rights, like you have this right or that right, this is the Malcolm X quote that I'll invoke here, that if they can give it to you, they can take it away. So it's like, oh, you have all these rights given by the Constitution or given by God or given by this or that, that you have rights and you have certain, almost like it's a privilege. This is not the way an absolutist would look at it. Right, this is how I would look at it. You would say, or objectively, this is how you would look at it. You inherently are free and uninhibited in nature. That's just your natural form. You're free to do anything you can possibly do. Right, anything you're physically capable of doing, you can do. So that's just an objective reality. So now it's not that you need to have rights given by something. It's more that you have rights taken away, and so that should be held accountable, and you should be sure that there's a good reason for doing that, if there even is any basis for it at all. So, for example, again, so you would say, oh, people have no rights. There's no such thing as human rights. There's nothing, because you're inherently free, and you can do whatever you want, anything that you're capable of doing when you're born into this world, right? You don't need to justify anything. You don't need permission. You just exist. There you are. And so you need, when an empirical structure and society and government and everything comes in towards you and tries to restrict and inhibit that inherent freedom that you have, that's not given by anything, you just exist. That's just, how you are. So they need a good reason, and that should be held very strongly accountable, so you don't need a reason to do something, we sometimes argue things in this false duality perspective, why do you need this, or why should you be able to do this? It's the opposite. Why should we restrict this? Why shouldn't you be able to do this? Right, but we come in from that sort of preconceived premise that we have to somehow justify what we do, not justify preventing people from doing something, right? You need a good reason to stop someone from doing something rather than needing a reason to do it in the first place, right? You can do anything, and that's not some position or opinion. That's just objective reality. If you can do something, you can do it, right? So you need a good reason to restrict it, which society often doesn't have, and just kind of people empirically just accept unqualified authority, unqualified empirical authority is just blindly accepted. So yeah, let's try to explain that once more. Just the fact that, you're in a position to reject the premise that, there's rights. You have rights. You're born into this world with God-given rights, or with, you're given rights by the Constitution and by society and this and that, right? As if you need those things. No, you're just born into the world, and so whatever you're capable of doing, you can do. And that's not an opinion or position like, oh, you can do that, you should do that. No, you're physically capable of doing various things, right? Anything you can possibly do, right? You can just do it. That's just the reality, the objective reality of how the world works. So if there's some restriction that needs to be imposed on that, that should be held accountable. Like, okay, there better be a good reason. There better be, some foundation to it. We better be aware of it. We better hold it accountable instead of just blindly accepting it. So what that means is, again, you don't have to justify things from a rights perspective, like, oh, I get rights from God, or I get rights from government, or I get rights from the Constitution, or this or that. It's rather that you are inherently free and can self-actualize and can do anything that you're capable of doing. Just an objective reality of nature. You can just do things. You don't need permission, right? You don't have to justify doing something, but society and government, etc., has to justify very strongly and very accountably why it would restrict you in any way. And so this isn't how it's actually applied. Unfortunately, people are mindless sheep who just go along with it, but this would be the very strong way that you hold it accountable, that if there's something you're restricted from doing, there better be a good reason for that restriction, and there better be a strong accountability that goes into it. Right, so you don't need rights, or you don't need to justify doing something. You need an empirical structure, etc., would need a basis to prevent you from doing it in the first place. Right, and again, that should be held accountable. And so, again, there are no rights. There are only restrictions, and those need to be justified and qualified and held accountable, and are often not, and are just overextended. And so on that same note, you talk about a basis for outward insistence. So as in a collective or society would have no credibility from this basis, because, again, it involves the assuming of the intention, which is inconsistent. So you would say, what basis does society or any other person have to tell another person what to do? And the answer really is that there is no basis, because everything is subjective. So this is one of the reasons why God is posed as like an absolute above everybody else. Because no matter what you say, right, like let's say a collective mass of a large number of people, millions of people agree on a certain point, right? Whether it be something moral or any aspect of society. Millions of people agree, but it doesn't matter, because that's still millions of subjective people. So they could be wrong throughout history. People have done all kinds of questionable things, even collectively, even government, supported by the government, and enshrined in law, whatever. Just, there are a lot of things you could question, so people aren't credible that way. And even if, again, the number of people, so it's like, a million subjective people say and agree on one thing, and one individual subjective person says something different. So in other words, it's hard to win that, because it doesn't matter at that point, because it's one subjective word versus another, so everything is arbitrary and subjective. So all it would take to undermine that is somebody just disagrees, and so their subjective word is the same as anybody else's. So right, it's on the same level, the same form, the same type of value. So just having more people who agree doesn't necessarily make you right. Or even if it did, then it's arbitrary, because, what if they had? So that would be the only difference. If they had more people agreeing, then that would make them right. So it exposes that as kind of a flawed process, because it's just one subjective person versus another, or one subjective view versus another. So, right, there's no credibility there. Now, when you look at the basis for outward insistence, there's a few problems with that as well. That you have, again, what would give you this, qualified empirical authority and basis to restrict or structure things, or to allow or to basically, again, like tell others what to do. The problem with that is you're assuming their intent. So you're saying, okay, this is what they want, or whether it be longevity process or something else. But what if they don't want that? What if they have some other measure or intention in mind? Right? You can't force that on somebody and say, oh, well, this is what you want, and so therefore you have to do this to achieve it. But what if they don't want that? What if they want something totally different? So that's a very, very unfair criteria. So you have again, like unqualified empirical authority, and it allows you to because again, where does that authority get its justification? And if you actually analyze the origin point of it, it's going to be arbitrary on a few levels. This is where I say, oh, the absolutist carves the path, whether you like it or not. You'll say, you'll stand on certain moral principles, right? Like, oh, we believe in this, and this is right, and so on and so on. But you only do that. Morality is the plaything of conquerors for their descendants to squabble over. This is a quote from one of my short stories, which is similar to things you hear sometimes in politics for other reasons, but like morality is nothing but the plaything of conquerors for their descendants to squabble over on lands, on the graves of on the graves of the conquered, and in a country built on the in a nation built on the backs of slaves and on the graves of the natives. So like you can act moral and on a high horse, but only after benefiting from some great immorality that happened in the past by your own standards. So in other words, there is no qualification. It's like, oh, you only got to this point and you're only in this position because of something you wouldn't have done or you wouldn't agree with. So like, oh, an absolutist comes along, historically, let's say, and Genghis Khan does something and he just conquers and he just does what, again, something that is effective. And so it's a Darwinistic thing. It's not about, it'll be condemned, like, oh, it's immoral. Genghis Khan was an evil guy. But yet every other leader and ruler and king might have wanted to do the same thing, right? They were conquering each other too. They were fighting each other too. So he was just better at it than everyone else. So don't mistake lesser ability for greater morality or greater ability for lesser morality, right? It's like, it's the same process at work. You're just better at it. That's why we remember you. But everyone else was trying to do the same thing, let's say, and he was just better at it. So again, that's where an absolutist would dictate the course of history either way. Like, you could condemn them, but that's what makes something happen, right? That's what pushes things forward or, defines value. So you would say, you would condemn the same process, but you would still benefit from it, or again, you would be on the spoils of it. So it's easy to act on a moral high horse once you've already benefited from it and reacted to that. Like, oh, you're if you're in a country, and this applies to everywhere, that's why I'm not trying to specify it. Like, oh, you're in a country that was, again, built on the backs of slaves and on the graves of the natives, and yet now you're going to act on a moral high horse. But if that didn't happen, right, if those immoralities didn't happen, then you wouldn't be here and you wouldn't be in this position to, maybe do anything at all. So yeah, the credibility of outward insistence is the fact that basically you there's no basis for outward insistence because everything is subjective and arbitrary. So it's like the non-basis of self, as I call it, like everything is zero-sum self-interest. So it's just overextended to a greater or lesser degree. And so what basis for empirical authority could there be? If you look at the origin point, you'll see it's arbitrary. Like I just pointed out, the immorality, or even just, it's some random dude. Again, either it's something you would have, like the origin point of why you are in a certain position, right? And the authority behind it and the situation, kind of the government or the society that you're in, right? The origin point would either be discredited morally, and you'll say, well, it was founded on this immoral thing that we would condemn now, but since it's already done, we just accept it and we treat it as somehow credible. Or it would be based on something arbitrary, like, some person in the past just decided randomly to do something a certain way, and now we just blindly accept it and don't think about it because we're not actively acutely aware of that, right? Like it's the origin point fallacy of critical thinking. If you saw me or some person come up with an idea in front of you, you might question it. You'll critically think, that's dumb, or I saw it was just some random dude who came up with this idea. You would question that, and you would critically think about it and scrutinize it. But because, it was done in the past and we just blindly accept it, and the origin point is out of sight, out of mind, we accept it. It's like a good example with tradition, like holidays and stuff like that. These things are arbitrary. If you try to introduce a new one, people would question it. But you just blindly accept the old ones, which again, it could be as simple as that. Some random person arbitrarily, subjectively just decided to do something, and then it just caught on, and then everyone just does it mindlessly. So if you were acutely aware of the origin point there, you would question it and say, not saying that you can't do it, but it wouldn't be so uniform or treated like an absolute. So the basis of that shows you the way that empirical authority exists is often not based in soundness and logic and reason as a result of contemplation and debate or anything like that, especially in like a specified universal sense, like one size fits all or some mass scale, because it wouldn't be so uniform, right? I always say there's nothing that would possibly lead to the specific contrivance state that you're in right now, right? No logical path or sound process would lead to that, right? Because it can't be the longevity process, because again, people drink and smoke, and there's not one logical sound basis or measure that would lead to the exact state that you're in, which shows you that, again, the unqualified empirical authority is based on bypassing critical thinking rather than actually answering it or being justified by it. So it's not that, the reason why society is the way that it is the authority structure is because it's, that's the right way and it's reached by some logical conclusion and discussion and objectivity. No, it's reached that way because of bypassing critical thinking by, again, indoctrinating people when they're young, too young to think for themselves. By the time they are, now we'll punish them or, use authority to bypass that. So it's not that it's answering all the questions, it's that it's bypassing asking them in the first place, right? Because again, indoctrination in youth and using like force and conditioning and reward punishment and, sort of training people like animals, none of that is actually justifying the specific state. So you're treating it as absolute, but again, the basis of it is arbitrary because again, it's based on the fact of bypassing the questions rather than providing the answers, right? It doesn't answer anything, it just prevents people from asking it at all. And then there's like one other point. Is the fact that again, you have like unqualified empirical authority, but then you also have sort of like forcing it on people, outwardly insisting, and Again, no credibility because everything is arbitrary, subjective. You can't assume the intent or measure that somebody has such that you could tell them what to do, right? Because you can't, assume their intent or force them to have it. Or what if their priority or their measure is something different than yours? So now it's impossible to say what they should do because that's their basis of value is different than yours. Their priority is different, whatever. So there's like one more expression I had that now I forgot. I was gonna say something. I said something similar to it. But again, the basis of something, the origin point, right? All of that is arbitrary, and so just blindly, mindlessly accepted. Again, it doesn't answer something. It more so removes the need or removes the ability to ask. Or so by that logic, then it's arbitrary. It could be anything.